The most expensive mistake a company can make is believing experience can be replaced by a presentation. Ethan Walker learned that on a gray Monday morning. The executive conference room overlooked the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Several landmarks stood in the distance, reflecting sunlight from glass and steel. Employees gathered around a polished table while presentation slides glowed on a large screen. Claire Montgomery stood at the front of the room beside a team of highly paid consultants brought in from a nationally recognized firm. The atmosphere felt optimistic, confident, forward-looking. Ethan sat quietly near the end of the table reviewing project reports. At 44, he had spent most of his career managing complex construction projects few people fully understood. He was not the loudest voice in meetings. He was not the most visible executive. Most people only noticed him when a problem disappeared. That morning, however, nobody seemed interested in discussing problems. Claire smiled as she addressed the room. After a thorough review, we have decided to transition project oversight to our consulting team. Several executives nodded approvingly. The consultants exchanged confident looks. One of them began explaining new strategies, new workflows, and new reporting structures. Charts filled the screen. Forecasts followed. Ethan listened without interruption. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply took notes. Claire continued. Their expertise will help modernize operations and improve efficiency across future developments. Around the table, heads nodded again. The decision had already been made. The meeting lasted another hour. When it ended, employees gathered their materials and left in small groups. Some avoided eye contact with Ethan. Others offered polite smiles. Nobody seemed certain what to say. Ethan closed his notebook and stood. Claire approached him near the doorway. I want you to know this is not personal. Ethan nodded. I understand. Claire appeared relieved by the response. Your experience has been valuable. Ethan looked toward the skyline visible through the glass. I hope the project goes well. That was all he said. No resentment. No frustration. No attempt to change her mind. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to his office carrying an empty storage box. The room looked exactly as it had for years. Project photos lined one wall. Framed construction drawings occupied another. He quietly packed notebooks, reference materials, and personal items into the box. Several employees stopped by to wish him well. Ethan thanked each of them. Before leaving, he opened a cabinet near the back of the office. Inside sat several old project binders. Thick. Worn. Carefully labeled. He studied them for a moment before placing a few inside the box. That evening, Ethan arrived home carrying the container through the front door. Lily sat at the kitchen table working on homework. She immediately noticed the box. Did they give you more work? She asked. Ethan smiled faintly. Something like that. Lily peered inside and pointed toward the old binders. Why do you keep those? Ethan looked at the weathered folders resting beneath years of notes and drawings. For a moment, he seemed far away. Then he smiled. Because sometimes people forget how things were built. Lily nodded even though she did not fully understand. Outside, the city lights began appearing one by one across the skyline. Neither of them noticed that several of the most famous buildings in that view shared something in common. Hidden deep inside old records, the same name appeared again and again. The following morning felt strangely ordinary. Commuters filled the streets. Construction cranes moved across the skyline. Meetings started on schedule. Yet inside the company's headquarters, the transition was already proving more complicated than the presentation had suggested. Jason Reed and his consulting team occupied the project management office that Ethan had quietly overseen for years. New reporting systems were introduced. New procedures appeared. New meetings filled the calendar. Everything looked efficient on paper. That was exactly why nobody noticed the first problem. During a coordination meeting, a senior engineer asked a simple question regarding utility access beneath a future development site. Jason reviewed the project files. Another consultant searched digital records. A third checked archived reports. Nobody had the answer. The engineer frowned. Ethan usually knew where that information was. Jason smiled confidently. We will find it. The meeting continued. 2 hours later, they still had not found it. Across the building, similar situations emerged. Small questions. Small delays. Small missing details. Nothing serious individually. Together, they began consuming valuable time. Claire received several updates throughout the week. None appeared alarming. Consultants assured her everything remained under control. The project schedule still looked healthy. Forecasts remained positive. There was no reason for concern. Meanwhile, Ethan spent his days very differently. After dropping Lily off at school, he organized the binders he had brought home. The old files occupied shelves in a small office beside the kitchen. Decades of notes filled the room. Project sketches. Site reports. Construction schedules. Problem logs. Most people would have seen stacks of paperwork. Ethan saw stories. Lessons. Solutions. Lily returned from school one afternoon and found him reviewing a faded set of drawings. Are those old projects? She asked. Ethan nodded. Some of them. Lily examined one page covered with handwritten notes. You keep everything. Ethan smiled. Important things. She pointed toward a photograph attached to one of the files. A large building stood against the city skyline. That place looks familiar. Ethan glanced at the photo. It should. Lily studied it for a moment longer. Did you work on it? Ethan closed the binder gently. A long time ago. Later that week, a young engineer inside Claire's company searched through archived records looking for missing project information. While reviewing old documentation, he noticed something unusual. Ethan's name appeared repeatedly throughout the files. Not as a project manager. Not as an observer. As the person solving problems. Utility conflicts. Permit issues. Scheduling emergencies. Design coordination challenges. The engineer found another file. Then another. The same name appeared again. He paused and looked toward the skyline outside the office window. Several famous buildings stood in the distance. He suddenly felt curious. Outside, the city carried on as always. Traffic moved through downtown streets. People admired landmarks without thinking about who built them. And deep inside a growing stack of forgotten records, the first clues were quietly waiting to be discovered. 2 weeks later, the first real delay appeared on the project timeline. It was not dramatic. No emergency meetings were called. No headlines were written. Yet inside large construction projects, experienced people understood a simple truth. Small delays rarely stay small. The issue involved a utility corridor running beneath a planned development site. The consultants had reviewed the plans repeatedly. Engineers examined the specifications. Contractors checked field conditions. Everything looked correct until excavation preparations began. Then a discrepancy emerged between archived site records and current documentation. Work slowed immediately. Jason Reed gathered his team inside a conference room covered with drawings and digital models. Hours passed. More reports appeared. More experts joined the discussion. Answers remained frustratingly out of reach. One senior engineer finally leaned back in his chair. Ethan solved something similar years ago. Jason glanced up. How do you know? The engineer opened an archived project file and pointed towards several handwritten notes. Ethan's name appeared at the bottom of the page. Jason studied the document carefully. The notes were concise, practical, direct. More importantly, they addressed the exact problem now delaying the project. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Across the building, Claire received another update. The consultants assured her progress continued. Technically, that was true. The project had not stopped. It simply was not moving forward as quickly as expected. Claire remained confident. Challenges happened on every major development. That was why experts were hired in the first place. Meanwhile, the young engineer who had discovered Ethan's name continued searching through archived records during his spare time. Curiosity had turned into something else. He wanted to understand why the same name kept appearing in critical moments across so many projects. One evening he entered the company's storage archive located in a lower level of the building. Thousands of documents filled shelves stretching across the room. Dust covered many of the older boxes. Most had not been opened in years. He selected several files connected to major projects completed throughout the city. A convention center. A hospital expansion. A transportation hub. A landmark office tower. Different locations. Different years. Different teams. Yet as he reviewed the records, one detail remained constant. Whenever a project encountered a serious obstacle, Ethan's name appeared shortly afterward. Sometimes attached to revised schedules. Sometimes attached to coordination plans. Sometimes attached to solutions nobody else had considered. The pattern was impossible to ignore. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping Lily with a school assignment about local history. She pointed toward a photograph in her textbook showing a famous downtown tower. "Have you ever been there?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the image and smiled slightly. "A few times." Lily studied the building. "It looks important." Ethan nodded. "It is." He did not mention spending years helping guide its construction. He did not mention solving the problems that nearly delayed it. He simply helped her finish her homework. Across town, the young engineer opened another archive box. Inside rested a faded blueprint bearing a familiar signature. He stared at it for several moments. Then he reached for another file. For the first time, he began wondering whether Ethan Walker had been much more than a project manager. By the end of the month, the delays had become impossible to dismiss as routine complications. Meetings grew longer. Progress reports became increasingly cautious. Consultants who had arrived with polished presentations now spent their days searching for answers hidden inside decades of project history. The problem was not intelligence. The problem was context. They possessed information, but they lacked experience. One morning, Jason Reed gathered engineers and planners around a conference table covered with drawings. Several unresolved issues remained open. Utility conflicts. Access coordination. Sequencing problems between contractors. Individually, none were catastrophic. Together, they threatened to push the schedule further behind. As the discussion continued, the young engineer who had been researching old archives placed a faded blueprint on the table. "You should look at this," he said. Jason examined the document. A signature appeared near the bottom corner. Ethan Walker. The engineer pointed toward a series of handwritten revisions. This was from a project 15 years ago. Jason studied the notes. The solution outlined on the page addressed a remarkably similar challenge. Practical. Efficient. Clear. No lengthy explanations. Just results. Another engineer leaned forward. I found his name on 3 more projects last night. The room grew quiet. Jason said nothing, but curiosity had begun replacing confidence. Meanwhile, Claire reviewed updated project forecasts in her office. The numbers remained manageable, yet something bothered her. Several challenges appearing today seemed strangely familiar. She remembered hearing similar concerns years earlier, only back then they had been resolved before reaching executive meetings. She opened older reports and started reading. Again and again, one name surfaced in the margins of documents. Ethan Walker. Not as the project lead. Not as the public face of success. As the person who stepped in when things became complicated. Across town, Ethan spent the afternoon organizing another shelf of project binders. Lily sat nearby drawing city buildings for a school assignment. She held up a sketch of a large convention center. "Do you think this looks real?" she asked. Ethan studied the drawing. "It looks like somebody worked hard on it." Lily smiled. "That means yes." She returned to coloring while Ethan opened another binder. Inside were photographs from projects completed years earlier. Stadium expansions. Transit centers. Office towers. Most people recognized the buildings. Few would recognize the names behind them. Later that evening, the young engineer returned to the archive room. This time he searched intentionally. He pulled files connected to some of the city's most admired landmarks. One by one, the same pattern appeared. Whenever a project faced a major obstacle, Ethan's name surfaced nearby. Coordination notes. Recovery plans. Revised schedules. Technical reviews. It happened too often to be coincidence. The engineer leaned back in his chair and stared at a stack of folders spread across the table. For the first time, he was not asking whether Ethan had contributed to important projects. He was beginning to wonder how many of the city's most celebrated buildings would exist in their current form without him. The discovery spread quietly at first. Not through official reports or executive briefings, but through conversations between engineers who spent their careers solving problems instead of presenting solutions. 1 file became 3. 3 became 10. Soon, a growing collection of archived records sat on conference tables throughout the company. Every folder seemed to tell a similar story. A project encountered difficulty. Schedules slipped. Costs increased. Confusion spread. Then Ethan Walker appeared somewhere in the documentation, and the problem disappeared. The young engineer continued his research late into the evenings. What started as curiosity had become an investigation. He reviewed the records of a major convention center completed nearly a decade earlier. The project had faced severe coordination issues during construction. Several consultants had recommended expensive alternatives. Yet buried inside the archive was a simple recovery plan signed by Ethan. The solution had saved months of work. Another file revealed a hospital expansion threatened by permit complications. Ethan's notes outlined a path forward that allowed construction to continue without interruption. A transportation hub. An office tower. A municipal complex. The pattern repeated again and again. Different challenges. Different teams. The same outcome. Across town, Claire Montgomery sat alone in her office reviewing updated progress reports. The consultants remained professional, capable, intelligent. Yet delays continued appearing where none had existed before. Small decisions now required extended discussions. Questions once answered immediately sometimes took days to resolve. Claire found herself thinking about Ethan more often than she expected. Not emotionally. Practically. She remembered how rarely problems ever reached her desk when he managed projects. At the time, she considered that normal. Now she wondered whether it had been exceptional. Meanwhile, Ethan spent Saturday morning helping Lily build a model bridge for a school competition. Wooden pieces covered the dining table. Instructions lay nearby. Lily studied the structure with intense concentration. "This part keeps moving," she said. Ethan examined the model. Within seconds he adjusted two small support pieces. The bridge immediately stabilized. Lily smiled. "How did you know that?" Ethan shrugged. "Sometimes you learn where problems are likely to appear." Lily looked impressed. "That seems useful." Ethan laughed softly. "It usually is." Later that afternoon, the young engineer visited a public observation deck overlooking the city skyline. He carried a notebook filled with project names. One by one, he matched buildings against archived records. The convention center. The hospital. The tower downtown. The transit station. He stared at the skyline for several minutes. People admired those landmarks every day. Tourists photographed them. Executives pointed to them with pride. Yet very few knew how many of those projects carried Ethan's fingerprints. Back at headquarters, Jason Reed received another project update involving a familiar issue. As he reviewed the documents, he noticed several references to old solutions found in archived records. Each pointed back to the same source. He leaned back in his chair and stared through the office window toward the city beyond. For the first time, a question entered his mind. What if the person they replaced had never simply managed projects at all? What if he had been the reason those projects succeeded in the first place? By the middle of the quarter, the consultants found themselves spending more time managing complications than advancing the project. Progress continued, but momentum had disappeared. Every solution seemed to uncover another question. Every adjustment revealed another dependency. The project was not failing. It was stalling. Inside weekly executive meetings, schedules became increasingly difficult to defend. Claire Montgomery listened carefully as Jason Reed presented updated forecasts. The chart still looked professional. The explanation still sounded reasonable. Yet one detail remained impossible to ignore. Nearly every major challenge now required reference to historical records. More specifically, records connected to Ethan Walker. After the meeting ended, Claire remained behind studying several reports spread across the conference table. One page caught her attention. A recovery recommendation recently adopted by the consultants had originated from an archive project completed more than 12 years earlier. She flipped through supporting documents and found a familiar name attached to the original solution. Ethan Walker. Again. Later that afternoon, the young engineer arrived carrying another stack of files. "You should see these," he said. Claire reviewed the documents in silence. The collection covered some of the company's most celebrated projects. Stadium expansions. Cultural centers. Transportation facilities. High-rise developments. Across dozens of records, Ethan appeared repeatedly. Sometimes as project manager. Sometimes as coordinator. Sometimes as the person called when everything else stopped working. Claire leaned back in her chair. Why was none of this ever discussed? The engineer hesitated. Because most of the problems were solved before executives needed to hear about them. The answer stayed with her long after he left. Meanwhile, Ethan's life remained remarkably unchanged. He drove Lily to school each morning. He organized old project records. He occasionally met former colleagues for coffee. The city continued moving around him while he quietly moved through his own routines. One Saturday afternoon, Lily accompanied him to a public park overlooking downtown. The skyline stretched across the horizon beneath a clear blue sky. Families walked along the paths. Tourists took photographs. Lily pointed towards several buildings in the distance. "Which one is your favorite?" she asked. Ethan studied the skyline for a moment. Then he pointed toward a modest structure standing between larger towers. That one. Lily looked surprised. Not the tallest one? Ethan smiled. The tallest is not always the hardest to build. She considered the answer carefully before nodding. Back at headquarters, Jason Reed sat alone reviewing project updates. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. The deeper he looked into the company's history, the more he realized he had inherited something he never fully understood. The systems. The relationships. The decisions. Many seemed invisible until they were gone. He opened another archive file and stared at a photograph attached to the inside cover. It showed a completed project from years earlier. Beneath the image sat a simple caption identifying key personnel. Near the bottom of the list appeared the same name he had been seeing for weeks. Jason closed the folder slowly. For the first time, he began wondering whether the company had not merely replaced an employee. Perhaps it had removed the person who quietly connected everything together. The archive room became the center of an unexpected discovery. What began as a search for missing information had evolved into something much larger. Engineers were no longer looking for solutions to current problems. They were tracing the history of the company itself. And everywhere they looked, they found the same name. One afternoon, Claire Montgomery decided to visit the archive room personally. Shelves stretched across the space from floor to ceiling. Boxes filled with decades of project records occupied every corner. The young engineer greeted her and led her toward a long table covered with open files. Claire expected to see a handful of documents. Instead she found dozens. Stadium projects. Convention centers. Transportation hubs. Hospitals. Corporate headquarters. Some were among the most recognizable structures in the city. Others had quietly transformed entire neighborhoods. The engineer pointed toward several pages spread across the table. These are all different projects. Claire nodded. I can see that. He turned another file around. Ethan Walker's name appeared near the bottom. Then another. And another. Claire slowly moved through the records. Recovery plans. Coordination schedules. Design revisions. Construction strategies. Every major challenge seemed to lead back to Ethan. She looked toward the engineer. How many projects are we talking about? The answer came quietly. More than we originally thought. Meanwhile, Jason Reed continued struggling with project delays. He had stopped dismissing the significance of the discoveries. In fact, he had begun studying them himself. One evening, he opened a project file connected to a landmark transportation center completed years earlier. The documentation revealed months of coordination issues, contractor disputes, and scheduling conflicts. Yet every problem eventually pointed toward a simple solution proposed by Ethan. Jason read through the records carefully. The more he learned, the less comfortable he became with his earlier assumptions. Across town, Ethan spent the evening helping Lily prepare a presentation for school. Her assignment focused on local architecture. Photographs of famous buildings covered the dining table. Lily pointed toward one image after another. This one is my favorite. Ethan smiled. That was a difficult project. Lily looked up immediately. You worked on that one too? Ethan paused. Then he nodded. A little. Lily laughed. You always say that. Ethan smiled but offered no explanation. Later that night, Claire remained alone inside the archive room. Most employees had already gone home. The city lights glowed beyond the office windows. She continued opening file after file. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Ethan was not simply involved in major projects. He appeared during the moments that determined whether those projects succeeded. She eventually reached for a large city planning map stored inside a flat archive cabinet. Colored markers identified many of the region's most celebrated developments. As she compared the locations against the records surrounding her, a strange realization settled over the room. The landmarks people admired. The buildings executives proudly referenced. The projects that defined the skyline. Ethan's name appeared in nearly all of them. Claire slowly looked out toward the city beyond the glass. For the first time, she was no longer asking why the company struggled after replacing him. She was beginning to understand who they had actually replaced. The realization arrived not through a single document but through a map. Claire Montgomery stood alone in the executive conference room long after sunset. The city skyline stretched across the windows, illuminated by thousands of lights. On the table before her rested a large planning map of the metropolitan area. Beside it sat stacks of archive files gathered over weeks of research. Hospitals. Transit centers. Office towers. Convention facilities. Cultural landmarks. One by one, she began placing markers on the map corresponding to major projects connected to the records. The process took nearly an hour. When she finally stepped back, the result left her speechless. Ethan Walker's involvement was not limited to a handful of successful developments. His fingerprints were everywhere. Some projects carried his name directly. Others contained his recommendations, recovery plans, coordination strategies, or design revisions. Together they formed a network of influence stretching across the entire city. Claire looked out toward the skyline. Buildings she had admired for years suddenly appeared different. Not because the structures had changed, but because her understanding of them had. The following morning, she called a private meeting with several senior executives. No consultants. No presentations. Only facts. The archive records were spread across the conference table. One executive reviewed them silently. Another examined project histories dating back decades. The room remained unusually quiet. Finally someone spoke. "How many landmarks are we talking about?" Claire answered honestly. "Almost all of them." Nobody responded immediately. There was nothing to argue with. The documentation was overwhelming. Across the hall, Jason Reed reviewed another collection of files. The deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. Ethan had not simply managed construction projects. He had preserved them. Rescued them. Connected teams when communication failed. Solved problems before they became crises. Many of the achievements celebrated by executives belonged partly to a man who rarely appeared on stage when projects were completed. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the afternoon attending Lily's school architecture showcase. Student projects filled the gymnasium. Parents walked between displays while children explained their designs. Lily proudly presented a model city she had spent weeks building. Roads connected districts. Bridges linked neighborhoods. Public buildings occupied carefully planned locations. Ethan listened while she explained every detail. "The important thing is how everything works together," she said. Ethan smiled. "That is usually the important thing." Later, as they left the school, they stopped near a hill overlooking downtown. The skyline stood against the evening sky. Lily pointed towards several famous buildings. "People really like those places." Ethan looked at the city for a long moment. "They do." Lily glanced up at him. "Did you help build any of them?" Ethan smiled softly. "A few." She laughed. "I knew it." Back at headquarters, Claire remained staring at the map inside the conference room. The evidence covered nearly every surface. Reports. Drawings. Historical records. Photographs. Yet one realization stood above all others. The company had not replaced an experienced project manager. They had replaced the man standing quietly behind many of the buildings that defined the city itself. And for the first time, Claire understood the full cost of that decision. Several weeks later, the company hosted a planning session for future developments. Senior executives, engineers, consultants, and project leaders gathered inside a conference center overlooking the city. The atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. Conversations carried less certainty and more reflection. Too many discoveries had changed how people viewed the past. Claire Montgomery arrived early and stood alone beside a window facing the skyline. The landmark stretched across the horizon beneath a clear morning sky. She recognized each one. The convention center. The hospital expansion. The transit hub. The office towers. For years she had admired those projects as examples of successful leadership and execution. Now she understood a deeper truth. Many of them carried the influence of a man who had never asked for recognition. Across town, Ethan Walker spent the morning helping Lily prepare for a school field trip. She packed a small backpack while describing everything she hoped to see downtown. Several of the locations on her itinerary happened to be buildings Ethan knew extremely well. He listened quietly and smiled as she talked. Later that afternoon, Claire requested a private meeting. There were no lawyers. No consultants. No presentations. Just a conversation. Ethan arrived at a quiet observation deck overlooking the city. Lily accompanied him, carrying a notebook she used for sketches. Claire greeted them politely. For a moment, nobody spoke. The skyline filled the silence. Finally, Claire looked toward the building spread across the horizon. I spent weeks reviewing records. Ethan nodded. I heard. Claire smiled slightly. I do not think I understood what you actually did. Ethan looked toward the city. Most people did not. There was no resentment in his voice. No attempt to make her feel guilty. Only simple honesty. Claire studied the skyline again. Your name appeared everywhere. Ethan remained silent. Hospitals. Transit projects. Towers. Convention centers. Ethan nodded once. Claire laughed softly, almost at herself. We replaced you because we thought we needed expertise. Ethan looked out across the city for several seconds before answering. Expertise is important. Claire smiled. That sounds like something you would say. Nearby, Lily sat on a bench sketching buildings in her notebook. After a few moments she walked over and showed Ethan her drawing. It featured the skyline stretching across the page. Several landmarks stood prominently in the image. What do you think? She asked. Ethan examined it carefully. I think you noticed the important parts. Lily smiled proudly. Claire looked at the sketch and then back toward the city. For the first time, she saw those buildings differently. Not as monuments to corporations or executives, but as the result of countless decisions made by people who rarely appeared in headlines. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the skyline, the three of them stood quietly overlooking the city. No public apology was necessary. No dramatic confrontation was needed. The truth had already done its work. The records had spoken. The buildings had spoken. The city itself had spoken. And standing among the landmarks people admired every day was the man who had helped make so many of them possible. Not because he demanded recognition. Not because he chased attention. But because real value has a way of revealing itself eventually, even when nobody is looking.